My name is Miller Files. I have worked enough cases to know that the most dangerous criminals are not always the loudest ones. Some do not threaten. Some do not demand money or recognition. Some simply act, then disappear, leaving nothing behind but confusion and fear. The case that would later be known as the Unabomber investigation began exactly like that, quietly. Without a name, without a face, in May of 1978, a small package was discovered in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago. At first glance, it looked harmless. A brown box, no return address, no message. Campus security treated it like lost property and sent it to another university office. That decision almost cost a man his life. When the package was opened, it exploded. The device was crude but effective. The injuries were serious but not fatal. At the time, no one imagined that this single explosion would be remembered as the opening chapter of one of the longest and most complex manhunts in American history. The early reports were confusing. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect. The device was handmade, assembled from scrap materials that could be found almost anywhere. There were no fingerprints, no identifiable tool marks, no chemical signature that matched known bomb makers. The case file began thin and stayed that way for a long time. Over the next several years, similar packages appeared. Universities, research centers, airline-related locations. Each explosion carried the same quiet message. Someone was targeting knowledge itself. Not power, not money, not revenge against a single person. Something broader, something ideological, though no one could yet explain what that ideology was. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually connected the dots. They created a task force and gave the unknown bomber a functional label, Unabomber, university and airline bomber. It was not a nickname. It was a placeholder for ignorance, a way to talk about a man no one understood. From the beginning, investigators believed they were chasing a highly educated individual, someone with technical skills, possibly a disgruntled academic, possibly a former engineer, someone who felt wronged by institutions of learning or technological progress. These assumptions were logical. They were also incomplete. What no one understood yet was that this was not a man seeking revenge. This was a man seeking correction. In his mind, society itself was the crime. Between explosions, there was silence. No letters, no phone calls, no claims of responsibility. That silence was deliberate. It forced law enforcement to work blind. Every new device was a fresh crime scene without context. There was no emotional outburst to analyze. No manifesto, no slogan. Just patience. I have read the original field notes from those years. Agents expressed frustration, but also something deeper, unease. This was not chaos, it was control. Whoever was building these devices was careful. He tested them, he improved them, he learned from each failure. That meant time, and privacy, and isolation. The investigation expanded nationwide. Tips poured in. Most were useless. Some were cruel. Innocent professors were questioned. Engineers lost their jobs under suspicion. Paranoia spread quietly through academic circles. People began opening mail with hesitation. Offices installed new safety procedures. Fear became routine. By the mid-1980s, the case had already consumed thousands of hours and millions of dollars. Still no arrest, still no solid suspect. The bomber had adapted. Devices became more lethal. Victims began to die. Each death hardened the pressure on the task force. Catch him or explain why you cannot. This is the part of the story most people forget. For nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber was not a genius villain in headlines. He was a ghost, a pattern without a person. And ghosts are the hardest things to hunt. At this stage, no one was asking who Ted Kaczynski was. They were still asking who could do this. The answer, when it finally came, would shock almost everyone involved. But that answer would not come from fingerprints or surveillance or informants. It would come from words, and that is where this case truly begins. Every long investigation has a moment where you realize the trail you are following is not wrong, but incomplete. The Unabomber case reached that moment quietly, without any official announcement. It arrived as a slow, creeping doubt inside the task force. The evidence made sense. The conclusions were logical, and yet the bomber was still free. To understand why the FBI struggled for so long, you have to understand who they were looking for, and more importantly, who they were not. By the early 1980s, investigators had formed a rough psychological picture. The bomber was intelligent, highly intelligent. The devices showed careful planning and an understanding of physics and mechanics. This suggested higher education, possibly engineering, possibly aviation. Combined with the choice of targets, universities, and airlines, the theory hardened. This was someone who had been inside the system and had been rejected by it. That theory sent agents in a specific direction. They looked at disgruntled professors, former graduate students, engineers who had lost funding, men who felt humiliated by institutions that once validated them. On paper, it made perfect sense. In reality, they were chasing reflections, not the source. What no one fully appreciated yet was that the Unabomber was not reacting to a personal injustice. He was reacting to an idea, and ideas do not age the way grudges do. Long before the first bomb was ever built, the man who would later be identified as Ted Kaczynski was already withdrawing from the world. His retreat was not sudden. It was methodical, like everything else he would later do. Ted Kaczynski entered Harvard University at the age of 16. On the surface, his story fit the American narrative of gifted success. A mathematical prodigy, a quiet student, a mind that impressed professors, but brilliance can isolate as easily as it elevates. Former classmates described him as distant, not cruel, not unstable, just detached. He did not form close friendships. He did not socialize easily, he observed, and when people observe without participating, they often begin to judge. During his years at Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a series of psychological experiments. At the time, these studies were considered legitimate academic research. Participants were subjected to intense intellectual pressure, humiliation, and challenges to their core beliefs. The stated purpose was to study stress responses. The unintended consequence was more personal. I have reviewed the transcripts of those sessions. What stands out is not trauma in the dramatic sense. It is reinforcement. Reinforcement of a belief that systems exist to dominate, not nurture. That authority seeks compliance, not truth. After Harvard, Kaczynski continued his academic path. He earned advanced degrees. He became a professor. On paper, he achieved what many would envy. But something critical was missing. He did not feel integrated. He felt observed, measured, controlled. Then, abruptly, he walked away. In 1969, he resigned from his teaching position. No scandal, no breakdown, just a decision. He withdrew from academia and from society almost entirely. He moved to a remote area of Montana. There he built a small cabin by hand. No electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences. This was not poverty. It was rejection. For investigators decades later, this decision was nearly impossible to factor into the profile. Law enforcement tends to look for escalation within society. More anger, more noise, more interaction. Kaczynski did the opposite. He removed himself so completely that he ceased to register as a threat. From his cabin, he lived simply, he hunted, he read, he wrote, and he thought a lot. This is where the FBI's model failed them. They assumed that a man who hated technology would constantly speak about it, protest, publish, join movements. Instead, Kaczynski did none of that publicly. His ideology fermented in isolation, without opposition, without moderation. By the time the bombs began, his worldview was already fully formed. Industrial society, in his mind, was not flawed. It was inherently evil. Technology did not merely inconvenience humanity, it enslaved it, and those who advanced it were not misguided. They were enemies. The early bombs reflected this philosophy. They were targeted, but restrained. Injuries rather than deaths, warnings without words. This was not fear for its own sake. This was demonstration, proof of concept. As years passed and nothing changed, his patience eroded. The devices became stronger, the outcomes more lethal. To Kaczynski, escalation was not cruelty. It was necessity. When warnings fail, consequences must increase. Inside the task force, frustration mounted. Each new attack deepened the sense that they were missing something fundamental. Agents debated whether the bomber had help, whether he had access to specialized equipment, whether he was moving across state lines. No one seriously considered that he might be staying exactly where he was. There is a reason wilderness criminals are so difficult to catch. Surveillance depends on infrastructure. Informants depend on social networks. Databases depend on records. Kaczynski lived outside all of them. He paid no rent, filed minimal paperwork, had no phone, no vehicle registrations, no consistent employment. He existed in the cracks between systems. When investigators tried to narrow suspects using lifestyle patterns, they unknowingly excluded him. He did not look like a suspect. He looked like absence. This period of the case is often summarized as stagnation, that is, inaccurate. The investigation was active, aggressive, and relentless. It simply lacked the correct lens. The bomber was not hiding in plain sight. He was hiding in irrelevance. What ultimately broke this stalemate was not a technological breakthrough. It was a psychological one, a realization that the bomber did not want to destroy society quietly forever. He wanted to explain himself, and that desire would become his undoing. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where the criminal makes a choice: stay hidden forever or step forward just enough to be seen. In the Unabomber case, that moment arrived in 1995, not with an explosion, but with words. For nearly 17 years, the bomber had communicated only through violence. Each device was a sentence. Each injury was punctuation. But there was still no explanation, no narrative, no claim of meaning. That silence had protected him better than any disguise. Then, suddenly, the silence broke. Major newspapers received a long, carefully typed document, tens of thousands of words, no diagrams, no threats written in rage. The tone was cold, controlled, and deliberate. The author called it a manifesto. He argued that modern industrial society was fundamentally incompatible with human freedom. Technology, he wrote, did not liberate mankind. It enslaved it. The demand was simple: publish this document in full, and the bombings would stop inside the FBI. This created immediate division. Some agents believed publishing the text would reward terrorism. Others saw opportunity. They understood something crucial. A man who writes this much is no longer hiding. He is revealing. After intense debate, the decision was made. The manifesto would be published, not because the FBI trusted the bomber, but because they believed he could not resist explaining himself. When the text appeared in the newspapers, millions of people read it. Most skimmed. Some dismissed it as madness. A few debated its ideas. But investigators read it differently. They read it like a crime scene. Language leaves fingerprints. The FBI brought in specialists trained in linguistic analysis. Their task was not to judge the ideas, but to study the expression, sentence structure, word choice, repeated phrases, unusual idioms. The rhythm of the prose. What they found was striking. The writing style was rigid but precise, formal but not academic. The author avoided modern slang. He preferred older constructions. He used certain phrases repeatedly, sometimes in unusual ways. These were habits, and habits are personal. This was not the voice of a collective. It was not the product of an organization. It was one man, educated, isolated, and deeply certain of his own logic. As the analysis progressed, the FBI did something unprecedented. They asked the public for help, not for sightings, not for tips about suspicious neighbors. They asked people to read the manifesto and consider whether it sounded like someone they knew. That request reached a man named David Kaczynski. David did not approach the text as a political argument. He approached it as a memory. Certain phrases felt familiar. Certain patterns echoed letters he had read years earlier. Letters written by his older brother. David had grown up watching Ted Kaczynski drift further away from society. He knew his intelligence. He knew his anger, but he had never imagined this. Still, the resemblance was undeniable. The decision David faced was not investigative. It was moral. Turning in a stranger is one thing. Turning in your own brother is another. He consulted a lawyer. He gathered old letters, essays, notes. He compared them line by line with the manifesto. The similarities were impossible to ignore. When the FBI received David's information, they did not rush. They cross-checked everything: linguistic patterns, biographical timelines, geographic feasibility. Slowly, cautiously, a name emerged where there had once been only a code: Ted Kaczynski. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Unabomber was no longer a theory. He was a person. Surveillance began quietly. No raids, no announcements. Agents observed a small, isolated cabin in rural Montana. They watched a man who fit no conventional profile of a serial bomber. He shopped rarely, spoke little, left no digital trail. What they did not see was as important as what they did. No phone calls, no visitors, no signs of collaboration. This was a solitary mind. The manifesto had done what years of investigation could not. It had collapsed the distance between the bomber and the world. By trying to be understood, he had made himself visible. In my experience, this is a pattern. Criminals who act for ideology eventually want recognition. They want their reasoning acknowledged. Violence alone is not enough. For Ted Kaczynski, the manifesto was not a negotiation. It was a confession disguised as philosophy. And once it was read the right way, the end became inevitable. By the time the FBI focused its attention on a small cabin near Lincoln, Montana, the Unabomber case had already rewritten the limits of patience. 17 years of explosions had led to a place with no electricity, no running water, and no visible connection to the modern world the bomber claimed to hate. It was almost poetic. The end of a technological manhunt was approaching without technology. Surveillance did not look like the movies. There were no dramatic chases, no high-speed tailing. Agents watched from a distance. They logged movements. They noted routines. The man they observed lived quietly. He walked into town occasionally, bought basic supplies, returned to the forest. He spoke little. He drew no attention. What troubled investigators was how ordinary it all seemed. This did not look like a man preparing mass violence. There were no visitors, no packages being sent, no sudden changes in behavior. If the manifesto had not existed, this cabin would have remained invisible. The FBI understood that this arrest could not fail. Any mistake could cost lives. They also understood that once they moved, the silence that had protected the bomber for years would end forever. In April of 1996, they acted. The entry into the cabin was controlled and precise. No shots were fired. No resistance was offered. Inside, the agents found what years of investigation had failed to uncover. There were bomb components in various stages of completion, tools fashioned for precision, chemicals stored carefully, detailed notes written in a tight, disciplined hand, and among them drafts of the manifesto, earlier versions, revisions, proof that the text published in newspapers was not an impulse, but a culmination. This was not a man improvising destruction. This was a man refining an argument. When the suspect was taken into custody, he did not speak much. He did not deny his beliefs. He did not express regret. He appeared calm, almost relieved, as if the tension between isolation and recognition had finally resolved. For the task force, the emotional impact was delayed. Years of frustration do not dissolve instantly. Agents walked through the cabin slowly, reading fragments of a private world that had been sealed off from society. They were not just cataloging evidence. They were confronting the reality that a single, isolated individual had held an entire nation in fear. The legal process that followed was complex. Defense attorneys argued mental illness. Prosecutors argued clarity of intent. The court records show a man who was intellectually capable of understanding his actions, yet psychologically incapable of abandoning his worldview. Throughout the proceedings, one truth remained constant. The violence had never been random. Every target fit the ideology. Universities, airlines. Researchers, symbols of progress as he defined it. For the families of victims, the arrest brought answers but not closure. Knowing who committed the crimes did not restore what was lost. It only ended the waiting. From an investigative standpoint, the case changed how law enforcement thought about domestic terrorism. It demonstrated that isolation can be as dangerous as radicalization within groups. It showed that ideology does not need an organization to become lethal. One mind is enough. The Unabomber was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The bombs stopped. The file was closed. But the implications of the case did not end there. When I look back at this investigation, what stands out is not the violence. It is the patience. On both sides, a criminal willing to wait years to make a point, and investigators forced to accept that sometimes the most powerful evidence is not physical, but human. The cabin in Montana is quiet now. The forest has reclaimed it. But the lessons of that place remain. Words matter, isolation matters. And when someone believes they alone see the truth, the consequences can reach far beyond their solitude. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment the story became understood. Every investigation ends on paper, a verdict, a sentence, a closed file. But not every case truly ends. Some continue quietly long after the courtrooms empty and the headlines fade. The Unabomber case is one of those. When Ted Kaczynski was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The bombs stopped. That fact alone created a sense of relief across the country. For nearly 2 decades, people had lived with the knowledge that opening the wrong package could end their life. That fear disappeared almost overnight. But relief is not the same as understanding. Inside the courtroom, Kaczynski did not behave like the monster many expected. He was not theatrical. He did not rant. He listened. Occasionally he objected, always with logic, always with the calm certainty of someone who believed history would eventually vindicate him. This is the detail that unsettled many investigators. He was not incoherent. He was not lost in delusion. He was consistent, and consistency in a criminal mind is often more dangerous than chaos. The prosecution argued that he knew exactly what he was doing. The defense argued mental illness. Both were partially correct. Kaczynski was intellectually capable and morally detached. He understood consequences. He simply did not accept them as wrong. From an investigative perspective, this forced a difficult conclusion. Intelligence does not prevent violence. In some cases, it accelerates it. When high intellect combines with isolation and absolutism, restraint disappears. After the trial, many asked whether the attacks could have been stopped earlier. The honest answer is uncomfortable, possibly, but only if investigators had been willing to imagine a suspect who did not want attention, did not want power, and did not want followers. The Unabomber was not building a movement. He was building a message, and for years he believed violence was the only language strong enough to deliver it. This case permanently changed how law enforcement approaches domestic terrorism. It highlighted the limits of profiling based solely on social behavior. It demonstrated that ideology can thrive without community, and it proved that language, not technology, can be the most revealing evidence of all. What ultimately ended the Unabomber's campaign was not surveillance equipment or forensic breakthroughs. It was a human decision, a brother choosing conscience over loyalty, investigators choosing patience over force, editors choosing publication over silence. As a detective, this case reinforced something I have learned repeatedly. Crimes driven by belief are not solved by chasing anger. They are solved by understanding conviction. Ted Kaczynski believed he was warning humanity. Instead, he revealed himself. Today, his cabin is empty. His writings are archived. His name is studied in criminology courses. But the conditions that shaped him have not disappeared. Isolation, alienation, distrust of institutions. These forces still exist. That is why this case matters. Not because of what he destroyed, but because of how quietly it all began. One man, one idea, enough time. I am Miller Files, and this was not just the story of how the FBI caught the Unabomber. It was a lesson in how the most dangerous threats do not announce themselves. They wait.